Excellency Jennifer Lee Morgan. We both look forward to what we are sure will be extremely enriching discussions in the next 3 hours. May we just have one housekeeping remark, please? The high-level ministerial dialogue is being webcast, and there is an overflow room available in room 21. Simultaneous translation is also provided into the 5 UN languages. With this, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Tony, and welcome. Very warm welcome from my side as well. I look forward to Secretariat. Mr. Simon Steele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and warm, what is it? We're in the afternoon. I'm not sure what time of day, morning or day it is, but good afternoon to all. So, distinguished ministers, colleagues and delegates, and dear friends, let me welcome all of you to this important ministerial dialogue on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. This is a hugely significant event. The deliberations taking place here today will build the foundations on which nearly all outcomes from our process are ultimately based. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our co-chairs, Frederica and Kishan, for their dedicated and capable work they have done throughout the year. Thank you. In my opening address, I made clear that what we need is everyone, everywhere, every day, doing everything they possibly can to address the urgency of this issue. So let me start by providing a baseline for these discussions. I'm not interested in a process which repeats the mistakes of the past. Our collective experience of the delivery of the $100 billion have been devastating for the trust within our process. We have 8 years, folks, 8 years to halve emissions by 2030 and respond to the impacts of climate change. Finance is the deciding factor on whether we manage it or not. Ensuring that the financial support that is needed is received at the speed and scale that the climate crisis demands is the primary success criteria for me. Over the past few weeks, and also in my previous participation in our process, I have seen some clear points of convergence on climate finance that we can all build upon. Glasgow laid out the political and technical criteria to undertake an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process to set our next goal. Ambition is our guiding light in these discussions. The new goal must set the level of ambition in mobilizing and delivering climate finance from all sources at a scale that reflects the needs. So let's do this properly this time, planning and appropriate tracking arrangements, ensuring we are supporting in a just transition. I'd like to see specific guidance from the technical teams. What is it that we need to agree at a political level, and what technical work can progress? Can you give us a roadmap of what we need to do next year so that we can effectively receive our political guidance towards COP28? I met with your leaders over the last 2 days, and not one of them suggested to me that we should be measured in our approach to this crisis. The independent high-level expert group on climate finance published their report yesterday. The report identifies the need for a breakthrough and a new roadmap on climate finance, seeking to mobilize $1 trillion per year in external finance that will be needed by 2030. I particularly welcome the recognition that there is a significant role from public policy and government action to foster investment, and complementary roles for the private sector, MDBs, IFIs, and concessional is very important when establishing overall guidelines. Let me highlight 3 areas that are, in my view, key backdrops. The first, the adaptation and mitigation-related needs and priorities in developing countries, not least in sectors such as energy, food, water, and health. Secondly, the availability of concessional finance and grants that are needed to implement mitigation, build resilience, and cope with the climate disasters that become ever more frequent and severe. Third, transparency and accountability must be assured as trust-building measures and as guides to inform investment plans and decisions. The new goal on climate finance offers us an opportunity to rebuild trust. Your deliberations today provide an opportunity to restore confidence in the finance streams of our process. They provide a clear sense of direction on how to address political and technical issues, building a shared understanding on how to address them going forward, and reflecting the scale and urgency of the situation we find ourselves in. Ultimately, our goal is to build a finance framework that cuts across every aspect of climate action, whether within or outside the intergovernmental process. A strong financial framework that supports mitigation by accelerating the spread of new sustainable technologies that allows for the phase down and phase out of fossil fuels. A renewed financial framework that enhances adaptation by supporting new approaches that reduce exposure to climate risk. A financial framework that speaks to loss and damage by providing the means to deal with the aftermath of devastating weather events. Let's use every tool in our toolbox, catalyze everything we can. I wish all of us the greatest success. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Executive Secretary Simon. And now it gives me a great pleasure to give the floor to Special Representative of the President of COP27, CMP 17, and CMA 4, Ambassador Wael Abdulmah, for some opening remarks. The floor is yours, Wael.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency Maria Antonia Yulu Loizaga, and thank you very much, Your Excellency Jennifer Morgan. And thanks also go to our Executive Secretary, Mr. Simon Steele, for his very important remarks. And indeed, a very warm welcome to Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the IMF. Thank you, Kristalina, for joining our discussions today. It's indeed my pleasure to open this with some remarks on behalf of the COP27 presidency. And first, before I make those remarks, I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank the co-chairs of the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal, Ms. Federica Fricano and Mr. Kishan Kumarasinghe, for the excellent work that they have conducted this year. Distinguished ministers and colleagues and friends, this is my 5th finance-related event today, and you'd expect all of them have addressed various aspects relating to the climate finance landscape, and all of them mentioned the issue of MDBs, the role they can play, the issues of philanthropies, private investment, issues related to debt, risk aversion, all of that. But I think the emerging theme from all of the discussions I heard was the importance of public finance, not as the sole solution, but as the Executive Secretary alluded to earlier, the issue of trust, the issue of confidence, the issue of communicating that countries in the developing South will not be left alone, and they can rely on developed countries to fulfill their commitments coming out of the legal agreements that we've all subscribed to. So this is a very important meeting of ministers at this level, and I'm glad that we were able to put it in place and start this conversation. Distinguished colleagues, we have made progress on this extremely crucial issue over the past few months. And in a few minutes, you will be hearing directly from the two co-chairs who will outline the results of their work. But we must remember that not only the recent occurrences of catastrophic climate change-related disasters and massive dimensions and the scientific evidence available to us all, but also the rationale for innovative finance for climate and development in developing countries all make it increasingly clear that there is urgent need to be creative and pragmatic in how we approach mobilization and delivery of climate finance for implementation of ambitious climate projects in developing countries, both on adaptation and on mitigation fronts. It's easy to see that climate finance is the sine qua non if we're going to achieve any of the objectives we want, either side of the coin, mitigation, adaptation, or for that matter, providing funding for loss and damage. It is against this background that deliberations on the new collective quantified goals should be seen. Last year, parties decided that as part of the deliberations on the new collective quantified goal, the presidency would convene high-level ministerial dialogues starting in 2022. Following this mandate, we as the presidency have convened you, Excellencies, today with the aim of ensuring effective political engagement and an open, meaningful, and robust discussion. As you also know, parties decided last year that the aim of the high-level ministerial dialogues would be to provide guidance on the further direction of the ad hoc work program for next year. Parties also requested the President of the Conference of Parties to prepare a summary of the deliberations at the high-level ministerial dialogues, including recommendations for consideration by the CMA at that session. Therefore, I would invite and indeed strongly urge you, Excellencies, to support us, the Presidency, in ensuring that we can deliver on this expectation and provide guidance to the further path of deliberations on this extremely important matter. The clearer we are in providing guidance today, the more targeted the work can continue next year. I leave you in the good hands of Their Excellencies Maria Antonia Yulo Loizaga and Jennifer Morgan, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for those clear words and a request for clarity. So I think that's a challenge given to us by the presidency here. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, for some further remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Great honor for me to be on this panel with people who do so much to advance the collective action on climate change. My thanks to all of them. And Simon, don't lose hope. You will know which day it is soon. I want to start with the words of Lord Kelvin, famous physicist. He did a lot to expand our understanding of heat and energy. And he said, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. When we talk about the 100 billion, if you cannot measure it, you cannot collect it. And I want to start with my first point. If we are to be successful in mobilizing climate finance way beyond the 100 billion that we are chasing for 8 years, it is paramount that we agree on measures of what investment needs there are in the developing world in net terms. In other words, if we were to count out what would have been fossil fuel investment, if we are to count in energy savings, what is the net still left? And when we talk about adaptation, the task is so not yet done. We have to agree what is adaptation measure versus business as usual, and how we estimate investment needs on that count. So my first plea to this audience is charge us, the financial institutions, working with the standard settlers to actually settle this issue. So during this COP, we no more argue what exactly is the size of investment needs for both. Second, we have to agree on a common definition of what constitutes climate finance. I have been in so many meetings in which we argue what exactly is being contributed by whom. And we have to settle this in the spirit of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance by being clear of the methodology of how we calculate climate finance mobilized, provided, and received. And third, we also know that trust gets eroded both ways. It gets eroded when funding promise is not delivered, and while I cannot agree more with you, the cost of loss of trust is much bigger than the financing gap. We also lose trust when we don't know how the money was used and what is the benefit for climate that is achieved. And in that sense, really important that we have good reporting standards on how climate finance provided to emerging markets and developing economies is making a difference. Beyond those key points, if we are to be successful, there is this overarching one, and it is promises made, promises delivered. Each and every one of us has a responsibility to start and end participation in these discussions. What is it that I promised? What have I delivered? So here is our record since the last COP. We promised to integrate climate in macroeconomic policies, both mitigation and adaptation, and we are way on the way doing exactly so. On the financing side, we promised to take a dormant asset, special drawing rights, in the hands of countries that don't need it, and turn it into an active investment on concessional terms. 40 billion mobilized today, and 4 countries have crossed the finish line on using this asset. Rwanda, Barbados, Costa Rica, and as of today, Bangladesh, and I see that there is a sign for Bangladesh. My simple message is this: time is not a friend, but strength in commitments and executing these commitments is all that makes a difference. So let's be true to our words and keep each other accountable, so the world is based on trust, not on disillusionment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those very strong and clear words, Kristalina. I think we've heard from our opening speakers speed and scale. We've heard ambition, we've heard creative and pragmatic, clear guidance, and now we've heard also about true to words, accountability, and trust. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to T.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. With this, we would now like to invite the co-chairs of the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, Ms. Federica Fricano and Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, for a presentation of the report on the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal in 2022. Madam Fricano and Mr. Kumar Singh, you may have the floor.
Thank you very much, Minister. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am Kishan Kumar Singh, and Federica and I were appointed to co-chair the ad hoc work program on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance for 2022. It is our distinct pleasure, therefore, to present to you the key findings of the work conducted under the ad hoc work program in 2022, which we captured in the annual report by the co-chairs. The report is available on the UNFCCC webpage. An addendum to the summary containing information derived from the fourth technical expert dialogue that took place on Saturday last week will be issued today or tomorrow. Excellencies, first allow us to provide a brief overview of the process related to the new goal that parties established in Glasgow, which includes both political deliberations and technical work, interacting in a cyclical manner with the political deliberations, providing guidance to the technical work to be conducted, and the technical work in turn informing the political deliberations. As for technical work, parties agreed to establish an ad hoc work program from 2022 to 2024 under the CMA, which Federica and I co-chair, including 4 technical expert dialogues per year. As for the political deliberations, parties also decided to convene high-level ministerial dialogues, the first one of which is taking place today. This will provide guidance on the further direction of the work of the ad hoc work program for the following year, 2023. Finally, at the CMA, parties will capture progress made each year and provide further guidance through the deliberations under the CMA agenda. I should now like to pass to Federica to take us through some of the key findings of the work conducted this year. Federica, please.
Thank you very much, Kishan. As Kishan highlighted, under the ad hoc work program, we organized 4 technical expert dialogues as mandated by the work plan. And today, I'm going to highlight some key findings that emerged from the technical work that we conducted this year. Participants recognized that the new goal provides an opportunity to accelerate the implementation of the Paris Agreement and its long-term goal. It became clear from the technical dialogue that the new goal should include both qualitative and quantitative elements, and that it needs to be a driver for transforming the way climate finance is currently mobilized, accessed, and delivered. The new goal should be informed by a set of principles, such as being accessible and inclusive, adequate, based on science and human rights, effective, predictable, measurable, transparent, time-bound, consistent with the principle of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Setting a new goal presents an opportunity to create incentives for both providers and recipients of climate finance to efficiently allocate financial resources, taking into account needs and priority of developing countries. The new goal should reflect a long-term perspective and should be also send a strong signal to various actors engaged in the climate finance architecture to make available finance that fit for purpose. Participants highlight that further discussion are needed to explore implication of implementing Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement for other provisions and commitment under the Convention, Article 4, and the Paris Agreement, Article 9, related to the providing financial support to developing countries. The new goal should have multiple elements that could be both qualitative and quantitative and have linkage across the elements. Possible element or sub-goal could be centered around thematic areas, sector, geographical regions, and recipient country and financial sources and instruments. There is a broad recognition that a bottom-up approach should be taken to setting the new goal, taking into account the needs and priority of developing countries, recognizing that many national reports do not contain cost estimates of needs and priority. We also heard different experience from countries suggesting that financing strategy and investment plans are useful for communicating needs and priority to potential public and private investors for implementation, providing a tool to translate them into action. Public finance has a fundamental role in relation to the new goal, including in terms of the signal it sends to other public and private actors, and how this role could be reflected in the operational elements and design of the goal needs to be discussed. Going forward, it will be necessary to develop a shared understanding of the scope and sequence of the discussion on qualitative and quantitative elements of the new goal. Finally, there are several synergies with other work and process within and outside the UNFCCC, and more work is needed to identify how and when they can feed into the process of setting the goal. Such processes include, inter alia, the global stocktake, the enhanced transparency framework, the global goal on adaptation, the work of the Standing Committee on Finance for addressing loss and damage, the needs and based finance project. And I will give back the floor to Kishan for the final key funding.
Thank you very much, Federica. Based on the discussions we would have had and the key findings, we would now like to highlight some areas that require further guidance at the political level. First, determining the quantitative elements of the new goal, including whether it should have one or several quantitative elements and which elements could be quantified. Second, whether and how the new goal should be based on a broader contributor base. Third, if and how finance for addressing loss and damage should be reflected in the new goal. And finally, how challenges due to the limited fiscal space of many developing countries, particularly in relation to accessing debt instruments, can be addressed through the new goal. Based on what we have heard in the past few days, the work program would also greatly benefit from further guidance on its direction, such as through a clear roadmap for work in the remaining time of its life to 2024. With this last remark, we conclude our work and hand over to you, Excellencies, for your further deliberations and guidance. Thank you for your attention, and I now hand back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Madam Fricano and Mr. Kumar Singh. We've heard the process that has been undertaken so far and the intersection between the political and the technical that are essential to this whole process. If I may now, this concludes the introductory part of this high-level ministerial dialogue, and I turn over to my colleague, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. So we're now, with these different inputs, we're going to move over to the interactive part of the ministerial dialogue. And as it was announced on the website, the presidency has identified a number of guiding questions to facilitate the discussions during this ministerial dialogue. So I'm going to walk you through them quickly. There were 5. The first is, how can the new collective quantified goal help effectively address the needs and priorities of developing countries? The second, what are the lessons learned and opportunities that can be drawn from the mobilization of and provision of climate finance? Third, how can the new collective quantified goal adequately reflect the evolving needs and priorities of developing countries in the context of implementing NDCs? 4, how can we consider other contributions in the new collective quantified goal context? And 5, what are the sources and instruments for the NCQG? And in order to kick us off and get our juices flowing here, we wanted to give the floor to a few icebreakers. And we're going to start off with our distinguished colleague, Her Excellency Rosalind Soipantua from Kenya, for the first intervention. Over to you.
Thank you very much,
There she
Madam
is.
Minister. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to make this statement on behalf of Africa. Climate finance is a crucial facilitator of climate ambition and action. Its provision and mobilization determine the extent to which developing regions such as Africa can respond to climate change impacts and implement our nationally determined climate commitments. We view the new collective quantified goal as a fundamental pillar of advancing a just transition to a low emissions and climate resilient development in a manner that spurs economic growth, eradicates poverty, and puts within reach our shared sustainable development ambition. The task at hand to set a new collective quantified goal demands that we do not replicate the shortcomings in setting and delivering the 100 billion per year, nor neglect the current realities of developing countries. Various reports demonstrate the enormous climate change needs of developing countries and how present public climate finance flows are unforthcoming, inadequate, and lack in quality. In addition, the current financial architecture features an unfortunate reality where developing countries, those that have least contributed to the climate problem, continue to shoulder climate costs, albeit their very limited fiscal space and constrained economies. African economies, for instance, allocate about 2 to 5% of their GDP to addressing adaptation costs, which does not come close to closing the huge adaptation finance gap in the region. The new goal must be ambitious enough to account for the needs and priorities of the region. I reiterate the position of African ministers of having a post-2025 goal in a range of at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2030. We have an opportunity to set an ambition goal by 2024, a goal based on the needs and priorities of developing countries. The quantum of the goal would not be just another number, as was the 100 billion but one that is carefully designed around globally shared desired outputs. Ideally, the amount arrived at must be informed by commonly agreed outputs that need to be financed. This is the only way to set a quantum that catalyzes finance at scale and centers financing on climate change needs and priorities as a driver for just transitions and economy-wide transformation. It is our expectation that this new goal process is organized in a manner that ensures we achieve the mandate to set a quantum. In this regard, several things are imperative to consider. First, in a world where climate change needs are increasing due to the exacerbating climate change, we need to develop an approach that would inform what goal we set in the context of diverse climate change needs. This is a central element in the new goal process. We owe it to ourselves to build an approach that inspires trust, hope, and action, one which acknowledges the full and diverse needs of developing countries. Secondly, such an approach should link finance to outputs that we want to achieve as a global community. The lack of progress we encounter in the current financial architecture can be overcome by bridging existing gaps in how we link needs and priorities to the determination of finance to be provided and mobilized. At the core of this process is the urgency to address gaps in how determination of needs and priorities is conducted. Third, Africa notes that finance in the multilateral process has largely been based on what developed countries can commit to provide and mobilize. This has limited ambition and action. A shift to what finance must deliver is required. Our view is that an output or impact-based goal is what we need if the new goal is to catalyze transformation. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, Africa appreciates the cyclic nature of the new goal process that avails this high-level dialogue a unique political space for us to inform the technical process. This dialogue offers an opportunity for leaders to provide guidance to the work on setting the new collective quantified goal. We all must start somewhere. If an adequate and ambitious goal is to be set, Africa believes that a time frame for the goal should be a starting point. This time frame should be linked to our NDC cycles, the cycle to produce needs determination reports, and the global stocktake. We need to have a shared understanding of the duration of this goal, shall cover and phlegmatically work backwards to situate the technical considerations in setting an ambitious quantum. Africa looks forward to a high-level guidance that reflects the needs to provide clear time frame for the goal and refocus the new goal process to setting the quantum. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. I want to now hand over to our second fire starter or icebreaker, which is none other than our distinguished colleague, His Excellency John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate from the USA. Over to you.
Jennifer, thank you very, very much, and thank you to all our colleagues here. This is perhaps one of the most important conversations that we can have and must have going forward, because we have a finance crisis and a pretense that has locked us all into a methodology that frankly just doesn't work. So, dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to be at the first ever high-level ministerial dialogue on the new collective quantified goal. And I express my thanks to the COP27 presidency for getting us all here and for assembling a terrific group of thought leaders and to help us chart the course ahead for dealing with this crisis. Finance is obviously, well, let me just be blunt, it's the key. I mean, I can't think of anything that is more of a barrier right now to our ability to be able to meet 1.5 degrees than the absence of finance. Every meeting I've had in the last 2 years as I've traveled the world is with leaders, most recently in Africa. They say, oh, I want to, you know, we have gas. We think we need to develop it because we've got to develop for our people. And gas is a problem for some people, but you help me develop. How are we going to do the renewables? How are we going to make a system that works for us so we can afford it, and the technology and the laydown? And the simple answer is, I sit there and I know in my heart and in my head, we don't have the money. No government in the world has enough money to be able to do what we have to do. The UN Finance Report tells us that the cost of keeping 1.5 degrees alive, which we continually put out, I do too, as the goal. It is the goal of Sharm. It's why we came here. But if we're going to win this battle, folks, we have to completely think differently about how we're mobilizing finance and what counts as mobilized finance. Right now, in the counting, we can only count money that's appropriated by a legislative body or that comes from the state. What are we talking about? First of all, I hope today, as you've all seen, maybe we've dodged a bullet and the United States will be able to actually add some more money. We're hoping. But the fact is that the governments aren't going to make that kind of difference. And then, of course, we have the COP at which Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister of Britain, kind of reached up into the sky to help settle a fight over what was going to be the fund that would be made available, and he pulled out a figure, 100 billion. And in the dead of night, people quickly put the 100 billion into the thing, and that's what we've operated on since then. Now, next year, we'll have the 100 billion, but everybody at this table and everybody sitting around this table knows 100 billion is a pittance compared to what we need. The UN finance report tells us we need 2.5 to 4.5 trillion every year for the next 30 years. We're not even at 1 trillion. We're barely a little over 1 trillion in terms of venture capital in the private marketplace. But governments aren't putting up that kind of money, and let's be honest with each other. Governments aren't going to. They don't have it. So how are we going to do this? How do we keep the world on a 1.5 degree pathway in order to be able to do what we need to do? And if we're serious about putting the world on a 1.5 degree pathway, and we are, 65%, let's talk honestly here today, because it's really important to do that. 65% of global GDP has put forward legitimate plans to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. Mostly from, obviously, the top 20 economies of the world, the developed world. Canada, Japan, Korea, US, UK, Europe. And now a few countries in those 20 nations are struggling to be able to come to the table. And so we're working an arrangement with Indonesia, we're working with Vietnam, we're working with Mexico, we're working with South Africa, working with India. People are working honestly to try to help change the dynamic. But we need everybody at the table, every source of revenue. Several of us, Germany particularly, stepped up, and the EBRD is putting 20 million in, and we're putting in 35 million in, and EU is putting about 30 million in, and then Germany is lending an enormous amount of money, almost 100 billion, in order to create a fund that will grease the skids so this deal can happen. But let me ask you something. How many times can we go out and get on the phone and scrounge and look for 20 million, look for 50, 30, and come up with 200? Just about exhausted it, probably, with that one deal. And we need hundreds of these deals. So I think we got to really talk about, how we have a transformative action, how we're going to frame something going forward and change the way we think about it and talk about it and act on finance under the Paris Agreement. The scale of global climate investment to keep 1.5 degrees is in the trillions. But we're not talking about trillions, and we need to start to talk about the trillions. Now, we did that today. I'm not going to go into it in any length with talk about how we may be able to frame a better carbon market in which we actually attract private sector capital, because that's where the trillions are. The private sector has trillions, and some in the private sector are saying they're ready to invest, but they need bankable deals. How do they get a bankable deal? Well, you've got to de-risk, and how do you de-risk? You need concessionary funding. Where's the concessionary funding come from? Oh, the governments don't have it, or won't put it up, or can't fast enough. So, my friends, I'm for taking a bold new approach to finance, where we are willing to rise to the level of the challenge and broaden our horizons in who we're going to tap for this money, how we tap this money. Maybe we need some kind of global transaction, penny on the whatever, that we're putting into a fund. Maybe we need to be thinking differently about, the capacity of nations and come to some kind of an agreement on what each nation's economy might be able to allow. And then, good luck trying to get every parliament and legislature to sign off on it, but we've got to at least start there. And I think we need to take a global view, and we need to be much smarter, I think, about what we consider to be viable money that gets to be counted. Let me give you an example. We had Donald Trump for 4 years, and he cut out all the money, zero money. And so when President Biden came in, he found a budget that was Donald Trump's budget. His first budget he could change was this year. and now next year, and he is changing it. And yeah, I'm sorry. So we're going to have to get money that comes in that somehow represents what nations can summon and mobilize. For instance, a month ago, we held a conference in Pittsburgh. Some of you were there. It was an energy conference, and President Biden put out a challenge, and the challenge was, let's raise $90 billion in order to accelerate technology and be able to deliver that to less developed countries and help people around the world. Guess what? 16 nations ponied up. We actually raised $94 billion, but it doesn't count for anybody in terms of what's been mobilized or what's been raised. So we have to change the way that we're counting. And we are fully committed, my friends, to supporting our partners in the effort to make this transition. And we know that we're not the only ones committed. Everybody around this table mostly is committed. But there has been a significant increase in international cooperation and engagement from new actors over the past decade. And we think that the bigger we grow the pie in this global economy, our economy is a 21 trillion economy, China's number 2, somewhere around 15, 16 trillion dollar economy, and then you keep going down. Obviously, emerging nations are the ones that are struggling, and we're well aware that 17 of the 20 most negatively impacted nations in the world from climate crisis are in Africa. And 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa equals 0.55% of all the emissions. So they obviously aren't the ones, they're the ones that are desperate to get some help. And most of us are desperate to be able to give them that help. So I think we have to figure out, mostly we have focused on public-private partnerships, or we have focused on places where public and private actors have actually financed projects on a project piecemeal basis. I don't think that's reflective of the needs of the private sector, including domestic private sector actors in developing countries, and I don't think it's reflective of our role as governments. We need to lean into our collective strengths, including deploying our scarce public resources where they'll be most effective to de-risk and to catalyze, and we all need to think about how do we catalyze the larger amounts of money from the private sector necessary to actually affect this transition. We have to have strong, ambitious, comprehensive NDCs still. After Glasgow, I'm going to be blunt, Glasgow called for those countries that hadn't raised their NDCs to raise their NDCs. And I leave it to everyone here to make a judgment as to whether or not here in Sharm el-Sheikh that happens. But we need that to happen, because that's what demonstrates our commitment to tackling this. There is nowhere other than finance, however, where it is more defined as to what we're willing to do and not willing to do, and as to whether or not our efforts to actually achieve 1.5 degrees are going to be real. I believe we can actually achieve 1.5 degrees. Why do I say that? You may doubt that, and I'll close sort of on this. Because Fatih Birol told us, the IEA told us in Glasgow, that if every promise made in Glasgow is kept, we would keep the Earth's temperature by 2050 at 1.8 degrees. That is with only the 65% of GDP participating. So if we can get the other 35 and more to come to the table, and if we can get everybody to figure out how we mobilize more private sector money, there's no question in my mind we can lower the 1.8. We may be able to even lower it right here in Glasgow, in Sharm el-Sheikh, building on what we did in Glasgow. But there's one truth leaping out at us, folks. If we don't do that, even if that 65% does what it said it's going to do and stays on the 1.5 path, we can't keep the 1.5 path alive without the others coming on board. If just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 major emitters don't step up, we're going to blow through 1.5. And as we sit here this evening, we are currently on track to hit 2.7. That is where we're going, or higher. So I pray that this issue of finance we will think about it differently. It is the absolute, it's the fundamental key to our ability to win this battle. And I applaud the nobility of the way in which nation after nation is trying to do this. And the nobility of so many of you who are the worst hit. Pakistan coming to the table with 31 million people displaced and just a shocking impact. We have to find a way to mobilize more money. We all know that. And I hope we'll be creative and frankly reach further than we have dared to reach yet in the effort to do that. And if we do, then I believe we have the ability to be able to actually keep faith with future generations, bring the technologies to the table that we need. We can win this battle, but only if we become more serious about reducing emissions at the rate that the science tells us. And I would remind everybody here, the IPCC has told us, the scientists have told us, if we do not achieve enough between 2022 and 2030, you cannot reach net zero 2050. And if you don't reach net zero 2050, you are blowing through 1.5. This is all mathematics and simple chemistry and physics, not my opinion or President Biden's opinion or anybody's opinion. It's based on science. And I pray we will think really hard about a world as rich as this world is, and we're blessed in that regard. We need to do more. My country needs to do more. Every country needs to find a way to do more. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that challenge, the challenge for creativity, the fact that the finance is the key. And I'm sure that we'll hear also many wise words and ideas from our next speaker, our distinguished colleague, Her Excellency Amit Deshana, Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology from the Maldives, for our next icebreaker intervention. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you, Jennifer. Excellencies, friends and colleagues, I'm speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. Increasingly, the assessments are pointing out to us that the real scale of climate finance we require is in the trillions. From an AOC's point of view, it is very concerning to us that the numbers we have right now on the mobilization of 100 billion do not add up. Some estimates are telling us that we will even miss the target in 2025. SIDS are on the front lines, and yet the 39 countries of SIDS only can tap into little over $1 billion of climate finance. This is also concentrated amongst a few countries, with some in our membership accessing acutely low levels of climate finance in comparison to the needs. Furthermore, the finance available for adaptation is woefully insufficient. The goal must therefore be informed by science and take into consideration the relevant findings from the IPCC, the Standing Committee on Finance, and outputs from the global stocktake, and take access into consideration. The new goal must reflect the urgency of transformative action through supporting higher ambition in developing country parties to effectively pursue efforts of limiting the global average temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees. While being ambitious enough to support developing countries' ability to adapt to projected temperature scenarios, the new goal must provide enhanced support for developing countries to address loss and damage. Identified needs in NDCs, adaptation communications, national adaptation plans, other national communications, and reports under the Enhanced Transparency Framework provide us useful insights into the priority needs of developing countries. The new goal must not only address quantum, but also address the quality of climate finance, especially for LDCs and SIDS. In this regard, funding for adaptation and loss and damage must be public and grant-based and would not be subject to access criteria such as demonstration of bankability, especially to meet the needs of SIDS and LDCs. Support for mitigation would compose of a grant component complemented by a concessional component, taking into consideration debt sustainability of recipients and ensuring current national debt levels are not exacerbated by climate finance flows. The new goal must also require all developed countries and multilateral institutions to collectively adopt a simplified and harmonized procedure for efficient and simplified access to climate finance, in particular for SIDS. AOSIS recognizes that while the new goal is first and foremost directed to developed country parties in accordance with Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, while we recognize the need to consider the mobilization of private sector finance to meet the needs of developing countries, it is well documented that leverage in private finance in SIDS, especially for adaptation, is very difficult due to the perceived risks that investors have to bear, including a low return on investment. It is therefore critical that access to private finance for SIDS needs to be urgently addressed in the context of the new goal in order to ensure that we don't remain a marginalized group. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for pulling out the key points that are important for AOSIS and for SIDS. I'd like to now invite our distinguished colleague, Her Excellency Anne Beate Tvinnereim from Norway, for our fourth icebreaker intervention.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for allowing me the floor as an icebreaker from Norway. I believe that the ice has definitely been broken already with the strong comments and remarks that we have already heard. I agree with Special Envoy Kerry's remarks that we need a bold new approach to finance, while at the same time we need to secure trust in the way ahead, in the goal that we are setting. The new goal should be ambitious, realistic, and achievable, and obviously set off from a floor of the US of $100 billion US per year, which must be delivered and will be delivered. But let me highlight a few of the points that I believe we need for success in the way ahead. First, the goal must address the needs and priorities of developing countries, which means that we need to take into account the information that we have from the national plans such as the NDCs and national adaptation plans. Second, as has been mentioned, we know that the needs are so much vaster than the present 100 billion goal can cover. And public finance can take us, it will be an important source in the way ahead, especially on adaptation activities and for the most vulnerable, but public finance can never meet the full needs. Which means that the new goal should send a strong signal on how we best catalyze private finance. One way, of course, will be through de-risking instruments such as equity and guarantees. In Norway, we have recently set up a new climate investment fund to speed up investments in renewable energy in developing countries, where the aim is to mobilize 9 times the amount provided by the state from private finance, from private actors. My third point is that this new goal needs to send a strong signal to both private and public sector. Currently, as you know, fossil fuel subsidies are outstripping climate finance flows globally. One of the 3 overarching objectives of the Paris Agreement is to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, and that objective must be an essential part of the new finance goal. Furthermore, if we, as parties, had a better understanding of the potential structure of the goal, it would help us to focus the discussions. That's what I believe. And that includes developing options for the quantitative elements of the goal. Given the very broad objective of the goal, a single target might not do the job. So to maximize our efforts, we also need to broaden the contributor base beyond what has been the case for the existing $100 billion commitment. Finally, please, our discussions need to go beyond mere numbers. We need to discuss how to mobilize financial resources to meet our targets, both national targets in developing countries, as well as the long-term targets of the Paris Agreement. And I believe that that would guide us, help us in the process ahead to agree on a new collective goal. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're going to now shift to our last icebreaker, and I'd like to invite Ms. Marie Pogestu, the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, for our last intervention before we turn to our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank UNFCCC and the government of Egypt COP27 presidency for the opportunity to join you at this ministerial. At a COP focused on implementation, obviously the issue of finance is paramount. First, we'd like to applaud the co-chairs and the UNFCCC for engaging so many stakeholders in this new collective quantified goal process. Colleagues of mine joined the conversations last Saturday and were impressed by the information and passion that different participants brought to the meeting. So this bottom-up process that you are convening is really, really very important. And the fact that the conversation is emphasizing both the high-level consideration as well as the very practical operational concerns means you are taking the most, tackling the most important conversations to be had. I'm in wide agreement on the urgency and the scale of the financing needed, but let me touch briefly on how the World Bank Group is thinking about some of these issues and hopefully provide you with some pragmatic ideas. First, on the quantum of finance needed. There are many estimates out there in the trillions, and we know the scale needed is huge. But what we want to focus on is what should the financing be used for to ensure that climate and development needs of countries is addressed. As you said, the needs and priorities of countries, how do they address the evolving priorities coming out of the NDCs? This is, I think, addressing this is equally important. And this is why the World Bank Group has launched a new diagnostic tool called the Country Climate and Development Report, or CCDRs. These reports combine the best available data, models that are based on simulating the NDCs as well as more ambitious NDCs, and tools to help policymakers identify pathways for low-carbon development and on the most impactful actions that can boost resilience and adaptation, reduce emissions, and protect natural capital, all while delivering on broader development. We've just completed about 20 CCDRs, and we will ultimately complete one for each of our client countries. They have a whole-of-economy approach and provide a good sense of what priority investments are, and speaks to the investment needs that Kristalina was talking about. These investments deliver the greatest development and climate value, and we also estimate the cost. And the cost over time, if you had, based on your NDC, if you are more ambitious, obviously, more scale and urgency is needed. This is very much a bottom-up assessment done in close coordination with the governments and all stakeholders. We believe that these can be useful for new collective quantified goal collective quantified goal process as the parties discuss what a new goal would look like, and that is at a scale that reflects the needs and priorities of developing countries, as was already repeatedly said. The second thing I would like to share is that there is a lot of talk about how to make this process more inclusive, including at the local level. So the bank is experimenting new approaches where local governments and communities have more influence over how the funds are to be spent. For example, in Kenya, the World Bank launched Financing Locally Led Climate Action to address structural inequalities that drive climate vulnerability for marginalized groups. The program strengthens the capacity of 47 county governments to work in partnership with communities to assess their climate risks and identify local resilience investments. Also, our IDA 20 includes policy commitments to support at least 15 countries to initiate local-level climate resilience investment programs. My colleagues will welcome the chance to brief you on this work. Finally, to the point about other contributors to the new goals that need to come, and I think everybody has mentioned this, the trillions are not going to get there without private sector. So the World Bank is working also to help mobilize private finance. And this capital, as we know, will only flow to investments that generate financial returns commensurate with the risks and if countries have the enabling environment. And to enhance countries' access to this capital in an affordable manner, governments, development finance institutions, and donors, including philanthropists, can work together with the private sector to mitigate some of the actual or perceived risks to lower the cost of accessing this capital. We and other MDBs are mobilizing private capital through by supporting policy and regulatory reforms, preparing projects to be co-financed with private co-financiers, and credit and political risk guarantees in new or frontier markets. We are also beginning to discuss with countries about using the CCDR as the basis for a country-led dialogue with other partners to really build that trust that everybody's talking together, bring together countries based on their needs and priorities, and bring together all the sources of financing, whether it's public, concessional resources from MDBs, bilaterals, private sector, philanthropists, and so on. So this is really what we would like to offer on the table, and we would really like to help you inform this process, and we stand ready to help you as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those insightful remarks. Excellencies, this completes our list of icebreakers. Thank you very much for your efforts to break the ice for our discussions today. Therefore, I would like now to open our discussions. My co-moderator and I will look forward to what we hope will be an engaging interaction amongst you, Excellencies. I will shortly invite you to take the floor to make interventions of 2 minutes in light of the limited time available, and I'm sure high interest in engaging in these vital deliberations. Seeing that this is meant to be a dialogue, we would like to invite you to engage with each other. So if you may wish to intervene in response to another intervention, please do not hesitate to raise your flag again. This is meant to be a conversational dialogue after all. My co-moderator and I may also come in with follow-up questions, as we would really like for this to be a conversation. Parties and observers are also invited to submit a longer written statement if they wish to do so, which will be published on the UNFCCC website. This way, maybe we can stick to the 2-minute intervention time and allow for a more interactive discussion and active engagement today. To reiterate, in your interventions, we would like to invite you to address the guiding questions that we introduced earlier, but also to respond to each other and engage on the issues raised by your fellow excellencies. My co-moderator and I very much look forward to what I'm sure will be lively discussions with this. I would like now to invite representatives of parties and observer organizations to start the interactive discussions, and would really like to call upon you to engage with each other as much as possible in your intervention. To request the floor, please press the button at the base of your units. At this point, I would like to invite interventions from excellencies from the United Kingdom and South Africa, please. Excellency.
Sorry, the technology is not quite working. But friends, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank our friends in Egypt for hosting us, and of course to Christian and Frederica for all the great work that they've done, taking forward the momentum that was built in Glasgow, and of course to everyone, because there's been a lot of work done in the technical dialogues. I agree with John Kerry when he says that we need to mobilize the trillions, and that will have to come from the private sector. So let's not kid ourselves that there is any other solution than that for the trillions. However, it is also vitally important for trust in this process that the 100 billion is actually delivered. Right? If we're going to have a post-2025 goal, we have to deliver on what was agreed beforehand. And it's something that we championed during our COP presidency. We, of course, also got the commitment to double on adaptation finance. And yes, it is absolutely regrettable that we have not got to the 100 billion in 2020. We know we get to 83.3 according to the OECD, and there's been some progress on adaptation finance, but we didn't get there. But I do want to place on record my thanks to the government of Canada and Germany and our friends Stephen and Jennifer for the work that they have done on the update of the $100 billion delivery plan that was set out last year. And I'm sure in their comments they will talk about this as well. But the one thing I can tell you is that they have confirmed that the 100 billion will be delivered in 2023. So just moving on to this next goal that we have and what comes beyond the $100 billion. Look, we've got some practical suggestions. So the first is, I think we have to learn the lessons from that $100 billion process. And we've got to recognize the shortcomings in that. And I think we need to move beyond just the quantum, and we need to embrace both the concept of quantitative as well as qualitative elements in the new goal. I think the two are important. I think the work that has been done in the update to the $100 billion plan reflects some of that qualitative element as well. And of course that means that we have to scale up public finance, we have to scale up grant finance, and yes, of course, mobilize private finance as well. But one of the things that I have understood through this process over the last 3 years is that grant finance is very important for very many developing countries. And I'm pleased to say that from a UK perspective, nearly 90% of our climate finance from 2016 to 2020 has been grant finance. The second suggestion is that we have to recognize the needs and priorities of course, our developing partners, and we have to consider all sources of finance to ensure that we are dealing with the level of response that is required. And that will mean a focus on total investment needs. It will mean delivering on Article 2.1c and, of course, addressing that issue within our overall financial architecture. I mean, you've heard the call from Mia Motley, from Secretary Yellen. My personal view is that I think the time is ripe for leaders to actually have a Bretton Woods II moment, where we come together and look again at the financial architecture that we have, much of which was set up decades ago and which does not have climate or response to climate anywhere in the purpose in their articles of association. I know there is work being done, but we need to have that moment, and we need to make sure that climate risk is weaved all the way through our international financial architecture. And Mari Pangestu talked, of course, about the need for more private finance. She's absolutely right. But let's be honest with ourselves, the leverage is not there right now. The leverage on public finance to private is not the level it should be, and I think that's where we need the MDBs to be doing even more with first loss products and the like to get the private sector in as well. And of course we need to be flexible and align with national strategies. And I think having those country-driven platforms is really important. The JETP with South Africa, which we got up and running, and John Kerry talked about the Egypt platform, which the UK has contributed to. Finally, the last point I want to make is that we have to consider other contributors to climate finance as well, and we have to include existing but unaccounted for climate finance flows as part of that. And I would just refer colleagues to what was agreed in the Paris Agreement, which stated, and I quote directly, as part of a global effort, developed country parties shall continue to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance from a wide variety of sources. Of course we will. Of course we must. The developed countries must take the lead. But we also need to acknowledge that in terms of a new goal, it has to reflect a global effort, and it has to include all sources. And I end with this. We all know that without the finance flowing, a lot of what we want to do is not going to be delivered. So I hope we are able to chart a path forward, bring together public, private, multilateral finance at scale, which will then allow our developing country partners particularly to follow through on their NDCs and have that clean energy transition, that move to climate resilient infrastructure in their countries that they want and which we need to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May we now call on Excellency from South Africa for his remarks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you very much to Kishan and Frederica for the report and for all those who have given us icebreakers to help frame our thinking this afternoon. I think 3 points one would want to make. The first point, and there seems to be broad consensus on this point, is that our new goal should be an impact-based process and should respond to the aggregate finances needed to meet the goals set by the international community to combat climate change, those goals being both adaptation and mitigation goals, as well as loss and damage, and in the case of developing countries, to address poverty eradication and achieve sustainable development. The second point really relates to the time frame. And I think it will be very important to align the time frame for the mobilization of finances, first of all with our aim to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and secondly, to ensure that finances are mobilized no later than 2050, where we would want to achieve a net zero emission target. And what this means is that we will need both decadal and annual financing goals. But we must have alignment between the finance goal and our broader emission reduction frameworks. The last point really relates to this issue of broadening the financial base. And I think I would want to support those who have indicated that a key component of the new goal process must be the reform of international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. If we assume that developing countries are going to continue to borrow to invest for climate purposes, the MDBs are going to need to provide a significant share of these resources. However, countries' preparedness to borrow from the MDBs will depend on the significant reforms to terms and conditions. And I think in this regard, others have already made the point about the current risk-averse nature of MDB loans, which we are going to have to change if we are going to be able to access the finances required. Secondly, there will have to be a significant approach to overall debt restructuring. The majority of developing country economies are already heavily indebted, and with current instruments available, it's not going to be possible to borrow further resources without significant debt restructuring. And finally, of course, we do need new and innovative financial instruments of a non-debt nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister, and also to bring in some of the clarity that the presidency, I know, is looking for on what are the sources, what are the instruments, what are the needs and the lessons learned. So as specific as you can be, colleagues, that's what the presidency has asked us to try and consider. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor to the Minister from Canada.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Colleagues, this is an historic moment for climate finance, for the UNFCCC, and for our collective capacity to rise to the challenge. We need to give the political profile this issue deserves, and we need to do so that we can drive ambition, collective resolve, and to ensure that we keep climate finance can enable us to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius in reach. Our hope for this COP is that we can reach common views on, one, how we will work towards meeting ever-increasing and urgent needs. Number two, how to make meaningful progress on loss and damage and carry this forward so that we can build on momentum at this COP and beyond. And reflecting on the $100 billion goal, I agree with what Alok said. I think there are lessons that need to be learned, but remember that before 2009, the very concept of climate finance did not even exist. And how many times did I hear in 2009 and after that there's no way the international community could mobilize $100 billion to fight climate change? And we're not quite there yet, but we are getting there. This goal was aspirational, but we are getting there. So what are those lessons? Well, it can't be a top-down approach, and I agree with many that have said that. It needs to take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. The NCGQ can also address the needs and priorities of developing countries if more resources are available from more sources. I totally agree with Alok when he talked about the need to reform those institutions which were not designed to tackle an issue like climate change. We need modern and dynamic definition for what these institutions need to do, what we need to do in terms of contributing to the goal. We need to tap into obviously the private sector, philanthropies that are also very keen to contribute, and we need to figure out how to unlock the money that is in the private sector. I would also agree with those that have talked about the need to the transformation that needs to happen in regards to Article 2.1c and Article 9. We need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. There's $700 billion that we can repurpose there, just there. And in Canada, we're making good on our promise to eliminate those fossil fuel subsidies, domestic and international, 2 years earlier than the G20 commitment, which was supposed to take place in 2025. We will be in Canada, we will have eliminated those subsidies next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. Now I'll hand it over to the Deputy Prime Minister from Somalia.
Thank you very much. Allow me to thank the co-chairs and the technical experts and the champions that have been working on different aspects of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to make my remarks very brief, and to begin with, I'm in full agreement with the representatives from Kenya who spoke on behalf of the larger African continent. And I think the technical reporters have highlighted 3 particular areas that need to be accounted for in terms of adaptation and mitigation, particularly in relation to the developing countries. The need to focus on the energy sector, food security, health and water. So as we pursue common objectives of trying to meet the targets, we also need to understand that differentiated approach, because we are in different situations in terms of our national development objectives. I represent Somalia, but Somalia is in the Horn of Africa, the larger African continent, where 600 million people don't have access to electricity and hundreds of millions are subject to poverty. Therefore, I think any new model should first, to begin with, be totally different from the previous one, in which we could not meet the pledges that were made in the past, and it should be one that incorporates the particular needs of least developed countries. In Somalia, as we speak now, half of the Somali population are living under drought, 7.2 million. We're subject to floods as well as droughts. So we need to have a very specific interventions. And the NDC, our national determinant quota is at $55 billion for the coming decade. And because Somalia is undergoing through in the last 4 or 5 years, we have undertaken SMP programs, and we are at an extended credit facility now, where we intend to reach the final completion point for a HIPIC initiative completion point, which means we are not in a position to seek loans. So to answer the question, what are the instruments that can be useful for financing climate change? Countries like Somalia cannot seek loans. Therefore, we're proposing that any new instruments must heavily focus on grants, and we also must encourage bilateral development banks, multilateral development banks to intervene and invest more in climate initiatives, as they have stated that they have started in different countries. Finally, there must be a common approach in terms of both, as you can see in the documents, African countries are only able to contribute up to 2 to 3% of their GDP to their plans, which means there is a need to find global financial mechanisms that would be different from the past, would be transparent, accessible, and implementable in a seamless manner, because the consequences of climate change are more profound in our part of the world, and we have very limited resources to combat this challenge. That would be my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you for calling attention to the contextual needs as far as the development situations of each country are concerned. May we now call for the interventions from Excellencies from Pakistan, to be followed by Sweden.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you at this point to Egypt and all the work and stamina that has gone into organizing this very important convening. I think there's been a sense of great expectations from this particular COP, known as the Implementation COP, and we are hopeful that some of the models being discussed here will actually go past a work plan that does not sort of cover at least 2 to 3 years. The issue here on my mind and my country's mind is loss and damage, very clearly front and center. And we have been working to put it at the heart of our discussions here. Now, it is not for us an adversarial position, nor reparations or compensation form of grant financing that we're looking at. But I'm coming from the ground zero of climate catastrophe where 33 million people were impacted, very high rates of fragility and vulnerability on the ground. And I'm seeing an accelerated needs as well, rate of needs as well as degree of climate change and warming moving much faster than our deliberations. That has clearly been a problem and a challenge. And I think the business of collectively coming to new milestones is very important, because for us it can't be business as usual. So if you're going to start discussing collective quantified goals, I think we all need to see a few things. One is that, look at a few things. One is that climate finance needs to be defined. What does it actually mean? What does it cover? And what ground is it speaking to? I hear a lot of good ideas, and of course some ideas that I don't think matter any longer, because as one colleague here said, we are racing past the 1.5 degree goal. I'm very clear that we're racing past it because in warmer climates, we're seeing the full brunt of that change. And in doing so, and in watching this and not being just standing there and being victims, what agency are we bringing to this table? How is change actually addressing our needs on the ground? Because this is not about abstractions. This is about people, communities whose lives are being lost and whose damage is incalculable. Having said that, the World Bank has been good enough to do a calculation of loss and damage from our recent floods after we went to 53 degrees centigrade, and we're less than a 1% carbon emitter, to tell us that it's $30 billion just for the aftershocks of this particular flood disaster. So yes, you know, we've discussed, we've put out projects that are bankable, and we are constantly asked to compete at international forums with bankable projects that then don't get actualized for 2 or 3 years. By then the needs on the ground have changed. And while the ADB and the World Bank and other IFIs have been on the ground with us, as the UN system has, I have to say, I have to appreciate that, there has been no consistent delivery of any level of green financing other than over 15 years, over $154 million. Now, the quantums here, I think, are disturbing for everyone. There is not enough money in the public financing system for the level of grant aid, et cetera, needed that we're hearing around the table. And for countries to be burdened with debt as they struggle with real human catastrophes on the ground, while being very low emitters, the questions to be asked is how meaningfully are we approaching the work plans that keep on moving modalities and the rest of the outcome-related actions to another year and to another year. So I think if we are able to do a few things, such as privilege or prioritize adaptation, the global goal on adaptation, as well as getting an instrument or a framework for loss and damage up and running, instead of just saying, well, we're going to be making the modalities, we look at the rules, we look at a new rule book perhaps, and we'll come back with a new framework next year. Many of us on the front lines of climate stress now cannot wait for that framework. I think that includes the SIDS and many of the other African countries closer to the equator, as we sit here too. So I think I'm not going to take more time, but I think we are all here with the right purpose, and there has to be that this is the entire COP system, to me, is pivoted on a bargain between the global north and the south. That bargain has to start meaning something on the ground other than humanitarian aid or long drawn-out work plans that we find don't speak to very accelerated needs on the ground, just like climate change. So I think these are the issues that need to be addressed. If we go outside this room, there will be two words that encapsulate everything on the table. That is action, and that is now. So when we look at those two words, I hear important advisories on this table. I hear a lot of frustration as well as passion. That's very good, actually, because we are not treating this as a theoretical abstraction. But please, we have to go beyond the ideas and mobilize the committees that define and find benchmark pathways to deliver this kind of climate financing, whether it's blended, whether it's private. Countries alone cannot access or compete for those amounts. So it has to be larger quantums. And when people turn and say, well, how do we mobilize that money? Most countries have supply line issues right now after the Ukraine war. Yes, we are aware of the impacts of inflation everywhere. That's not going to change, is it? And while money is made available with great speed and agility for wars, it's time we figure out, we look at where we are going with saving the planet, because we are fighting over a planet that may not be around to save. There will be very little to save. One ecosystem starts dying, it will have a domino effect on others. And if we can build arcs for our elites, that's not an answer. Which is why there is a level of frustration, but also a need for creating a new signal for hope. We need to signal that beyond putting loss and damage on the agenda, we are not afraid of moving into a phase where goals are quantified within the ambit of a month or a conference itself, as opposed to meeting in salubrious climates all year round to talk about it and actionalize our plans. This is very much the need of the hour. And so finally, I'd like to say that I do appreciate that there is a sensitivity to the fact that people are facing, and countries and communities are facing climate change at different levels of speed and velocity, much faster than anticipated. For us, 2050 is too far out. We are saying now that let's not, if we delay definitions, if we delay putting loss and damage, yes, time's up. Time's up for everything, frankly. Putting loss and damage on an actionable agenda with a framework, then the signal we are sending each other and the rest of the world is that vulnerability is a death sentence. And I don't think we want to walk away from that with that message. Everyone here is quite focused, quite sober, and in their own space, in their own limits of action, quite clear that they want to go forward. Let us just do this faster than we are looking at doing, especially the new collective quantified goals. The registries of what that constitutes and how we go forward needs to be accelerated, just as climate change is accelerating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Before we go on to our next intervener from Sweden, may I just appeal to our Excellencies to keep within the time limit. We do have a very long list, and we would like to recognize everyone. May we now hear from Excellency from Sweden, please.
Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to be here as Sweden's new Minister for International Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade. And allow me to make 3 points. Firstly, the evidence is clear on the urgency for climate action. And while the transition will require huge resources, delaying action will be even more costly. And as a global community, we must also gather around the opportunities that climate action can bring in terms of new jobs and growth. Secondly, we now have the opportunity to develop and agree on a goal that can contribute to the broader transformation and shifting of financial flows in our economies, in line with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This new goal must be a catalyst for change on a global level, a change that has already started happening, but that needs to be accelerated. And the goal should, for example, relate to elements such as carbon pricing and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. Thirdly, in this context, scaling up private capital is crucial. However, not as a substitute to public finance, which of course will be essential to support the most vulnerable countries and communities and to leverage private capital, but as a complement to it. And I would also like to underline the importance of integrating climate action in national budget and planning processes, paving the way for enhanced national resource mobilization. Finally, the EU has come to Sharm el-Sheikh with a commitment to maintain momentum on keeping 1.5-degree target alive, and we need to strengthen our ambition and implementation in this critical decade. But we are also disappointed that parties did not accept our request to formally discuss how to make finance flows consistent with the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. This is a missed opportunity for all of us. I would like to close by encouraging continued efforts to ensure an open and inclusive process in the continued dialogues and deliberations, allowing for a wide range of perspectives and voices to be heard. This is crucial to achieve a transformative new goal that can contribute to a global transition that is just for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now turn to Indonesia and then the farmers' groups. In Indonesia, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the government and the people of Egypt for hosting this COP27. Also, thanks to the co-authors for the report. I think this, generally there is an agreement that we need to be more bigger quantum, and we have to learn a lot of lessons from the 100 billion commitment in the past. The suggestion to go with a clearer definition moving forward that are agreed by both the developed and developing countries is very encouraging, but it's going to take a lot of efforts to actually agree on what should be on the table. But we do agree that the scope of the new goals should be quantitative, qualitative. Financial instruments need to be laid out, sources of the funds, channeling. I think it's going to be very important to be elaborated, as well as the mechanism for monitoring and covering the needs of and priorities of the developing countries. I would like to highlight that the new goals should also cover the just and affordable transition. Transitioning to the low carbon economy is quite tricky. A lot of developing countries will face this pressure. Usually this is why the private sector comes into place. The G20 under the Indonesian presidency brings up the discussion that there is a need to develop the high-level framework for the transition finance. This is where the private sector should be put in place, and this high-level framework is expected to help the financial market being able to support the just and affordable transition to the global economy. This is also in line with the report saying that we have to connect the dots of different efforts that are already ongoing. And finally, I would like to make a suggestion that the transition finance should also be supported by the country itself. It is important that the country is ready to load the carbon. Indonesia, for example, we established the energy transition mechanism with the Asian Development Bank. We are ready with the number of projects. We are ready with the number of gigawatts that we will reduce the early retirement of our coal power plants. Now we need the money. The country platform is there. It already been launched last July and will be announced in the G20 summit next week. So let's see whether we actually can get the international support on the moving to the low carbon economy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Over to the farmers' groups.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. This is on behalf of the farmers' constituency. We want to see financial framework support our ambition, support a just transition, and a dynamic agriculture sector. Much too little climate finance has been allocated to agriculture in the past. This imbalance we must address. We want to see the operating entities of the finance mechanism, such as GCF, assign a higher priority to agriculture and involve farmer organizations.
Thank you very much, Doreen. We also would like to see innovative financial models to finance climate actions in the sector. We like to see the need for continued exploration of, including the blending of public and private sources, for example, for ecosystem services like carbon sequestration. And for this, there is a need for a better global coordination to encourage governments under the convention to include agriculture and forestry in your NDCs. And therefore, the Global Farmers Constituency call on all parties to establish a cross-boundary permanent body under the convention that deals with all aspects of agriculture. As Loreen mentioned, much too little global climate finance has been allocated to agriculture previously. We are seen as a major part of the problem sometimes, but we are not allocated the adequate funds to deal with this. We are not given the chance to be a major part of the solutions. So therefore, we want to see the operating entities such as the Green Climate Funds to really allocate or to give a bigger priority to agriculture and to forestry. And we also would like to see the existing climate finance become more accessible so that, as the colleague from Pakistan mentioned, the context on the grounds don't change before action actually happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May we now call on the ministers from China to be followed by Italy. Excellency from China, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam. The Chinese delegation is speaking in the name of Head of Delegation, Vice Minister Zhao Yingmin of Ecology and Environment, and expresses his apology for leaving for another engagement a few minutes ago. It is a good opportunity to have in-depth face-to-face exchange with all parties and colleagues on the new collective quantified goal. We would like to take this opportunity to share China's views on this issue. Climate finance is a core concern of developing countries, and NCQG for the post-2025 is of the core concern of climate finance, which has attracted high attention from all parties. In this regard, China would like to put forward 3 constructive proposals. First, the NCQG is an important principle consensus of the Paris Agreement. It should be guided by Article 2 and 9 of the Paris Agreement, taking into account the concerns of developing countries in terms of financial scale, areas of support, and degree of preferential financing. Focus on the balance between mitigation and adaptation, and achieve a new financial target that satisfies all parties and matches the level of financial support with the level of climate action. Nowadays, many developing countries are in the critical stage of building their industrial base for green and low-carbon development, as well as infrastructure for climate resilience, which means both necessity and opportunity for public finance support from outside of their countries. As we all know, the new collective quantified goal is a follow-up issue of developed countries' commitment of 100 billion commitment. Regrettably, developed countries have so far failed to fulfill their commitment of this $100 billion per year in climate finance by 2020. In particular, there is a huge gap in financial support for adaptation, which seriously hinders the efforts of developing countries to address climate change. Second, providing climate finance to developing countries is the obligation of developed countries. We call on developed countries to meet the 100 billion goal as soon as possible, make up for the shortfall in climate finance by 2020, and put forward a roadmap for doubling adaptation finance as soon as possible. We hope that developed countries will actively participate in the process with good faith and set new collective quantified goals for the post-2025 period to the satisfaction of all parties. In terms of sources of funding, public finance from developed countries should be the main source of funding, and on this basis, further mobilize funds from multilateral development institutions, the private sector, and other sources to play a complementary role. We expect a more ambitious commitment from developed countries on the scale of public finance for climate change. The importance of private finance need not to educate us here. Thirdly, the developed countries should continue to improve the transparency and the predictability of climate financing. According to the climate finance, whether additional in official development, whether to belong to grants or provincial financing, support domains, beneficiaries, and improve channel in detail, such as forming more transparent, objective, and scientific climate fund reporting and accounting methods. Dear Ministers, in order to implement the relevant consensus of the Paris Agreement, we call on developed countries to demonstrate the political will and work with the international community to accelerate the formulation of new collective quantified goals for developed countries beyond 2025, based on the climate finance needs of developing countries. We thank you, sir. Madam.
Thank you very much, Minister. May we now call on Excellency from Italy.
Thank you very much. Distinguished ministers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank Federica and Kisham for the outstanding work done as co-chairs of the ad hoc work program for the new goal. The new collective quantified goal on climate finance provides an opportunity to accelerate implementation of the Paris Agreement by reflecting a long-term perspective and sending a strong signal to the various actors engaged in the climate finance architecture. We understand that the only way to address the growing needs and increasingly pressing priorities of developing countries is to make every euro count. All sources, instruments, and channels should be wisely employed where most needed and best fit for purpose. In order to do this, all sources, instruments, and channels should be made available to support most vulnerable countries and communities and those most in need. Everyone, according to its respective capabilities, should do its part to address those needs. We understood from the experience of the collective commitment of mobilizing $100 billion per year that the new goal cannot be a single number, but instead we have the opportunity to get a deeper understanding of the complexity of the climate finance landscape to shape it so that climate finance will be increasingly fit for purpose. However, the timeline timeline is clear, and the determination of the quantitative aspect, which should take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries, needs to consider a range of parameters which are under discussion in the work programme. We look forward to have common ground on the building of foundations of the NCQG in order to be able to finally decide on the quantification. The new goal won't be the panacea or the only solution to the challenges of effectively providing climate finance to developing countries, but from this perspective, the new goal can provide significant guidance, incentivizing the transformational action we globally and quickly require to keep 1.5 alive. For this reason, we consider fundamental that the NCQG incentivizes all actors to make finance flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. We have a great opportunity ahead of us. Let's make it the best use of it with our collective ultimate goal in mind and pursuing mutual collaboration, encouraging ambition in action, doing our best and trusting the multilateral process can deliver what is needed. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're now going to turn to Nepal, to be followed by Tuvalu.
Thank you, Chair. Ministers, Excellencies, and distinguished participants, a very warm namaste from the Mount Everest and the country of melting Himalayas. Nepal considers setting the new collective quantified goals extremely important, as this process leads to financing climate actions beyond 2025. Over the years, the technical expert dialogues and have dealt with many important elements of delivering climate finance to developing countries. Nepal has actively been engaged in these processes. Nepal believes the work in 2023 and 2024 should further enhance the process to set up a new goal based on science as well as the needs of developing countries, particularly those vulnerable and capacity constrained like Nepal. The learning from the delivery of 100 billion goal must also be taken into consideration. The new collective quantified goal process must deliver on both the quantitative new collective quantified goal process must deliver on both the quantitative and qualitative aspect of climate finance. Nepal has faced difficulty in accessing climate finance, as the access process in itself is very lengthy, cumbersome, and often difficult to understand. We hope these aspects will be duly taken into consideration and dealt to solve this. The new collective quantified goal process must have a clear quantified goal with the sub-goals on adaptation, mitigation, and very importantly on loss and damage. The sub-goals would allow to strike a balance between the three different themes. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thanks also for some very specific ideas about how to formulate this. And with that, I'd like to turn to Tuvalu, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm sorry my minister have to leave for another engagement, but he mentioned that for us, the smaller countries, the support for smaller island states at the moment for Tuvalu is not really working in all the adaptation finance and mechanisms. We are not waiting anyway in Tuvalu. We are trying to make innovative work and defend our own land. You know that the water the highest points in Tuvalu are barely 2 to 3 meters above the sea level. So some innovative work that we are doing is that we have now established our own trust funds where they are governed by international agreement so that the donors can provide resources in, but we have had some successes in our own sovereign funds, and that's why we are copying that idea. Innovative finances should be readily accessible for smaller island states, and we will go along with ideas about blending finance, including our contributions from our own resources in our small island states. And that's the main key for us, is that we can't wait until for another 20 years, because by that time we'll be fully inundated by the sea level rise. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. May we now invite His Excellency from Zambia and then the representative of UNEP PRI to be followed.
Thank you, Chair. My minister sends his apologies. He had to go for another engagement. Let me just start by really just re-emphasizing what the U.S. government put out, that success really will rise and fall with the climate performance. And then also I just wanted to point out that we align ourselves with the statements from Somalia on the issue of the challenges of debt, the issues of concessional financing, and with South Africa when it comes to the issue of reform of MDBs. Zambia has been leading on the Africa group of negotiators on the technical side, and we want to deliver the following messages. Well, first and foremost, we want to point out that the Africa group recalls the commitment made by developed countries to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for the adaptation to developing countries. Would want to just also point out that setting a formal stream of work on the doubling of the adaptation funds by 2025 is extremely important. Similarly, Africa Group emphasizes the need for Annex 2 parties to the UNFCCC to urgently deliver on the $100 billion goal that has not been met. Fulfillment of financial pledges is key for implementation, hence central to solidifying trust needed to enhance cooperation in tackling climate change. On the collective quantitative goal, the Africa Group reiterates its position on the importance of an impact-based process that considers needs and priorities of developing countries. This goal must be ambitious enough to account for the enormous climate change needs and priorities in the region. We reiterate the position of African ministers on having a post-2025 goal of the provision of at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2030. To help effectively address the needs and priorities of African countries, it's important that new collective quantitative goal adequately reflects availability, predictability, access, and at scale. On loss and damage, this remains important to Africa. Clearly, as evidenced in the recent developments, this is rolling back our development efforts. And it's important that we should see that the multilateral process should be able to structure a post-event reconstruction and economic regeneration plan for growth. We note the limitations of the existing operational entities and the global financial architecture in providing finance for loss and damage. Africa looks forward to the funding arrangements which would be cognizant of the need for the provision of new additional public finance for developing countries. We need to think outside the box. Chair, in the interest of time, I just really want to point out that developing countries really face limitations in fiscal space, and it's important that concessional financing be provided. I think leveraging the resources from MDBs becomes extremely critical. I also want to point out that I think in the presidential statements, there was a lot of emphasis put on the need to support Africa, because Africa does provide solutions in terms of its carbon sinks, and therefore really if we can save Africa, really we can save the world. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister, for pointing out that limited fiscal space will require a certain amount of attention and care, and to the potential for Africa to provide nature-based solutions. May we now call on the representative from UNEP PRI.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm the CEO of the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment. We're an organisation of over 5,000 investors around the world, which represents more than $121 trillion committed to responsible investment. We've been undertaking a consultation with our members around the world in the past few months, and our members have identified climate change as the #1 issue and a strong desire and a real will to play our part in addressing climate change. They've also indicated that we should focus on policy as a high priority. Now, it's clear that we're not seeing the shift of the trillions of private finance that we need to see to deliver on our collective objectives. But we are confident that this can happen. Latest available evidence shows that around half of financial flows are still going into fossil fuels, but half is now going into clean energy. We've seen hundreds of investors signing up to net zero initiatives and looking for ways to play their part. The PRI is involved in many of these, and we're committed to supporting our signatories in showcasing best practice and sharing lessons learnt. But this year's events have shown how fragile this progress can be. It's hard to change behaviours which have delivered success in the past, and governments and private actors alike can easily return to practices that are tried and tested. Any hurdle along the way slows the transition process down and lowers our hopes of keeping 1.5 alive. So investors need strong policy frameworks that will back national decarbonisation objectives in the short, medium and long term. We need to really look at how governments, including through the COP process, can operationalise the objectives to make financial flows consistent with low greenhouse gas, climate resilient developments. And we'd be very happy to continue with providing our views with this engagement going forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll now hear from Argentina, followed by Bangladesh.
Thank you very much. Argentina will be speaking on behalf of ABU, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Our group has been very active in the negotiation of the new global goal as it is an issue of high priority for our countries. Climate finance negotiations will be crucial to a successful outcome of COP27, in particular the deliberations on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. We are extremely worried about the failure of developed countries to fulfill their provision and mobilization commitments towards developing countries. This is particularly worrisome in the context of global inflation. The $100 billion is not worth the same as they did in 2009. The needs and priorities of developing countries are evolving, and the new goal should take this into consideration. It should be flexible enough to encompass new technological developments and adjust to also evolving socioeconomic dynamics and environmental challenges. Developing countries are the hardest hit by the adverse impacts of climate change and the ones who need financial and technical support the most. As of now, there is no room for us to be discussing an expansion of the donor base in the NCQG when our countries are struggling against flood, drought, and to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. From ABU's perspective, we understand that we have a mandate for the work program to be finished by 2024, but this should not impede us from making progress. At the COP of implementation, parties should make progress and show ambition. In this topic, ambition relates to having an early harvest. We support a concrete CMA4 decision on the NCQG, which encompasses both progress in the process and substance of the technical expert dialogues, and encompasses 3 key messages. First, the NCQG is an obligation and a commitment of developed countries for the provision of public funding and their leadership in mobilizing climate finance to developing countries based on their historic emissions, equity, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Second, the NCQG should ensure that sources and instruments for the provision and mobilization of climate finance have a strong focus on public, grant-based and concessional resources, as well as avoid exacerbating the levels of indebtedness of developing countries. It should be science-based and take into account the needs and priorities identified by developing countries in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. The private sector will play a complementary role in the commitment of developed countries under the NCQG, which should ensure accountability for the mobilization of private finance through public interventions. We need to address the lack of risk appetite of the private sector in adaptation activities and scale up their contribution on that area, as we know that private investment flows relatively more easily to mitigation actions and projects. Abu is also of the view that at COP27 we should provide the technical work with further guidance on the conduction of the technical dialogues. A clear roadmap with topics for the technical expert dialogues in 2023 to guarantee predictability and allow the preparation and full participation in the discussion is key in that sense. The test should prioritize discussions on the quantitative elements of the framework of the NCQG, as well as on access modalities, accountability, transparency, and both existing and innovative instruments. It is unacceptable to hear that we have to have an aspirational goal when the title itself says quantitative and financing. There is a year ahead. Let's not waste any more time. We would like to ask the COP27 presidency to reflect these elements as suggestions in the report of this high-level session. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, we need not waste any time. Over to Bangladesh.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator, and greetings to excellencies and colleagues. Before submitting the statement on behalf of the LDCs, I just wanted to respond to some of the discussion that has gone on, in particular on how we frame this agenda. What is the context for this agenda? And we, of course, all know that times are hard. There is an economic crisis. Inflation is on the rise. There is a possible recession. But these crises should not be equated with climate change. I think that's something that is very important for us to understand, appreciate, and acknowledge. Climate change is an existential crisis. And to be very honest, the funds did not flow when times were good. So yes, we take into account that these are difficult challenges, difficult times, but this should not be an excuse for not to act when it comes to climate change. I think that's the first point that we would like to make. We have also heard from the Honourable Minister from Canada that there is about $700 billion being paid as fossil fuel subsidy. So it seems to us that on the one hand, we are encouraging rise in emissions, and on the other, we are trying to say that we have to address climate change. So I think this is a contradiction that also needs to be resolved when we frame the discussions. And we must also be aware that whatever we invest, and I use that term deliberately, I'm not using spend, whatever we invest in climate change today is always going to be less in terms of what we have to pay tomorrow. So if you look at it in terms of the benefit of action and the cost of inaction, I think the imperative of acting now becomes even more important. The third point as a preface to my submission on behalf of the LDCs, the goals that we are talking about will take firm shape in 3 years' time. So what happens between now and these 3 years? We cannot lose sight of that. We also have to think about the gap years, because the 100 billion was supposed to come on board in 2000. So what is going to happen between 2000 and 2024? The 100 billion should equally apply to that, and we should not lose focus. And when we talk about the amount of fund, the Honorable Alok Sharma referred to an amount of 80 billion, but that has been challenged. Oxfam is actually talking about 1/3 of that amount that has been spent. So we need to, I think one of the first things we need to do is to quantify what we mean by climate finance. That's important. In terms of the statement from the LDC, we will submit a written version to you, and we would request you to consider this as part of the submission. But may I very quickly capture some of the main points. The new goals should be based on needs as informed by science. I think that is very important. It's not an arbitrary figure. We heard about the 100 billion just as a notional political figure, but now we are talking about quantified goals. So it should be based on science. We should be looking at not just the amount and the quantum, but also the quality of finance. That is equally important. And we strongly feel that developed countries are responsible for leading the provision and mobilization of resources to deliver that goal. The goal and its implementation thereof must be transparent and accountable. There are a few other points. I've already talked about the need for a clear definition of climate finance, which is something that the LDC strongly feels. We should also understand better the financial needs of the developing countries, and this should also be in place before 2024, along with the definition of private finance, of climate finance. The new goal should be composed of an overall quantitative and qualitative elements, because quality of finance is important. We need adequate, timely, predictable, and accessible resources, avoiding further increase in debt levels in LDCs. The new goal should address mitigation, adaptation, and also, of course, loss and damage. And if required, we can consider thematic sub-goals. The goals should also have intermediate milestones to enhance predictability and continuous implementation of climate actions. This is important because the plans that we make will go over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So predictability becomes very, very important. This also means that we should review the goals on a periodic basis and adjust, tweak, fine-tune as necessary to reflect the evolving and changing needs and new information that becomes available. This is particularly important because a lot of the countries are planning on the basis of 1.5. We know that based on current projections, we are hitting 2.8. So if the temperature rises is substantial relative to what we are predicting now, then the needs of the countries will change, and so will the need for finance. The last point we wish to make, which we think is very important from the LDC's point of view, is the issue of debt. This is growing, and the importance of addressing these issues is critical. So the finance that we are talking about has to be grant-based as opposed to repayable and renewable instruments, and we must address the concerns that climate finance is increasing the debt burden of the world's poorest and highly indebted countries. So that is the submission on behalf of the LDCs, and we will submit a fuller written version for your records and also for reflecting it in the discussions. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Minister, for the very specific discussion. May we now call on Excellencies from Armenia to be followed by Chile.
Thank you very much. Sorry for my voice. So, Excellencies, Ministers, so what are the lessons learned from these years? Not proper use of cost-benefit analysis for climate investments and lack of synergic approaches for climate projects at national, regional, and international levels are among other reasons have made us be far from the annual target of 1.5. And for that, it is not important, is it 100 or 200 or whatever billion, because the reality that already mobilized finance resources is in most cases, not always appropriately or fully met or served the objectives of the climate agenda. On the other hand, developing countries have sufficient capacities in public investment, while developing countries do not have enough local capacity yet to develop investment-ready projects and create a national project portfolio, particularly for climate projects. And I believe that the main barriers hindering the implementation of climate projects of developing countries is absence of the noted portfolio, but that must be for sure sustainable and at least not changeable portfolio for maybe 10 years if the project has passed the appraisal and prioritization, because time is not a friend. It's a result of the fact that developing countries allocate huge funds to service their foreign debt along with other social, health, educational expenses, and in the case of Armenia, also expenditure to address defense and security threats. Taking into account the need of having a sustainable system for serving foreign debt by developing countries and the importance of fulfilling commitments of all countries under the Paris Agreement, Armenia proposed an innovative climate finance mechanism that enables a certain part of the external debt to be directed to solving climate problems and accumulate additional climate finance flows. To ensure the developing of investment-ready projects, the government of Armenia implementing practical steps. In particular, it has created a public investment management system which enables the development of feasible projects. And now we are trying to identify typically the climate resilience project by developing climate PIMA project. Since not all platform and mechanisms have been identified for ensuring collection and efficient use of financial resources required for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, we are looking for new innovative climate finance as well as the other countries. This tool enables developing countries to negotiate with developing countries and convert bilateral external debt into adaptation and mitigation projects while enabling developing countries to fulfill their obligations under the Paris Agreement. The use of the mechanism will also allow reaching the annual target that we need, and it is 100 billion, but it was mentioned many times today. It is not. Anyway, the goal is to reach the target of 1.5. So we have mentioned two-level system of funds, secondary the PPPs that we also talk about much, but it is still not enough. So last but not least, countries should also facilitate establishment and advancement of mechanisms aimed at creating enabling environmental for attracting household savings to climate projects, such as investment funds and crowdfunding platforms. Armenia's private sector entities are currently establishing closed and investment funds that will exclusively concentrate on provision of equity investment to green projects. Specific organizational level taxonomy document is being designed to define priority sector for such investment. So I think the trust that we talked today a lot is very important for countries like ours, because people must believe in this, because people must know why we spend so much money in this target and when we will reach it. So thank you very much. Hope we can all do this together, and Armenia is in this target with all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. May we now call on, it's actually from Chile.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, distinguished ministers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Apology from our ministers that couldn't be here for this important dialogue. We welcome the efforts done so far and appreciate the work done by both co-chairs, the Secretariat, and those countries that have hosted 4 technical expert dialogues so far. We would like to suggest some ideas and very quick points to improve this important process. First, we need to consider the principles of the Convention and focus on the framework of Article 4 and 11 of the Convention and Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, and allow greater diversification of funding sources, emphasizing the delivery of grants in order not to further harm the high debt burden of developing countries, as other speakers have already mentioned. Second, we cannot wait until 2024 to advance in the quantum, the time frame, among other important aspects. We see that the process of the new goal on finance must achieve clear milestones of progress up to 2024 to define the core elements of this goal, including the definition of a number or numbers, but also covering a comprehensive approach of how to define the financial transition to 1.5 degrees. Third, it is important that in the following high-level dialogues and the 8 TEDs that we still have to organize and perform, the co-chairs are provided with a mandate to produce technical documents to identify possible common ground and develop proposals that can help us move forward in technical aspects of the new goal. Fourth, the goal must be balanced in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but it should also include a clear focus on loss and damage. It must be connected with the principles such as the net climate finance and reaffirm its link with Article 2.1c. The goal must also aim at transformative change. Incremental change is no longer an option if we want to stay below 1.5. Fifth, and finally, as the goal must be based on needs, we also need to consider the important gap that exists on the estimation of financial needs in developing countries. As an example, today the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean released a report that indicates that the region needs about 4.5% of its GDP annually to comply with our NDCs. This estimation needs to be refined and adjusted for each country, for each sector, but the development and covering that gap of information can better inform the new goal and make it more relevant and adequate. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the specific suggestions. I think we're now going to move to Ecuador, followed by Bolivia, please.
Muchas gracias, señora facilitadora y distinguidas excelencias, ministros y ministras. Quiero tomar esta palabra a nombre del ministro de Ambiente de Ecuador. El ministro se tuvo que retirar por un compromiso que tenía. Quisiera solo hacer una reflexión rápida con respecto a la primera pregunta. Creo que varias de las intervenciones que me han que han venido antes de mí se han enfocado en las segundas dos preguntas, y la primera pregunta no la hemos reflexionado lo suficiente. Creo que todos estamos conscientes de la urgencia que se necesita, del nivel de fondos que son requeridos, de las posibles fuentes de financiamiento, pero ninguno ha hecho una reflexión acerca de qué tan apropiadas son esas fuentes de financiamiento o esas acciones que estamos planteando en línea con las necesidades y las prioridades de los países en desarrollo. Y la razón por la que queríamos traer esto a la conversación es porque los últimos datos que nos ha presentado el Comité Permanente de Financiamiento incluyen temas como que incluso dentro de la cooperación bilateral, solo apenas el 57% es no reembolsable. Eso significa que casi el 50% de la cooperación bilateral en adaptación sigue siendo reembolsable. Que menos del 5% del financiamiento de MDBs es en calidad de donación, y que cuando hablamos de financiamiento privado, que también es algo que se ha mencionado mucho, el 86% del financiamiento privado se está enfocando en la mitigación. Y ninguno ha abordado el rol que deberían tener las entidades operativas del mecanismo financiero. Nadie ha hablado del rol que debería tener el GCF, el Adaptation Fund, el GEF, cuando en la actualidad menos de 5 billones al año están entrando por estas fuentes. Entonces, quería traer eso a la conversación, porque es importante también pensar cómo las acciones que estamos proponiendo van en línea con las necesidades de los países en desarrollo, con las prioridades de los países en desarrollo, cuando en realidad lo que nos están diciendo los datos sobre el financiamiento disponible en la actualidad es que no está en línea con esas necesidades y prioridades, independientemente de la cantidad. En términos de calidad está funcionando muy mal, y las propuestas que se han presentado sobre calidad planean replicar o escalar sobre una calidad ya muy mala. Entonces, queríamos traer esa reflexión a la conversación y dejarlo hasta ahí por términos de tiempo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, and also for bringing in issues that haven't actually been addressed yet. I think that's important that we get everything that we can out on the table. Next over to Bolivia, please.
Muchísimas gracias. Voy a hablar a nombre del ministro Juan Santos Cruz, que ha estado visitando Sharm el Sheikh y por tareas que tenemos en el país ha tenido que retirarse. Nosotros hemos estado siguiendo atentamente a lo que acontece en el mundo entero. El comportamiento del climático es una preocupación absolutamente seria para toda la humanidad y tenemos indicadores. Pero acá hoy día se ha puesto en mesa preguntas claves, señora Presidenta, y todavía no estamos haciendo respuesta a esas preguntas que se han puesto sobre la mesa. Eso nos preocupa. Este es el escenario para poder cambiar de conducta y para generar nuevas recomendaciones en bien de la humanidad, en bien de los medios de vida que existen en diferentes partes del planeta Tierra. Si en acá no cambiamos de conducta, de actitudes y de recomendaciones, prácticamente la COP27 habría sido simplemente una COP más de las tantas que ya estamos celebrando. Por eso nosotros queremos hacer un llamado de los compromisos pendientes que todavía se tiene desde Copenhague, cuando se tiene un monto que se habló de 100.000 millones de dólares que se debía implementar a partir del 2020. Hay indicadores a la fecha en diferentes países que están habiendo desastres naturales, lluvias, granizos, vientos, huracanes, etcétera. Pero si hoy no actuamos la humanidad, va a ser tarde, porque esa acción debe ser inmediata. Solamente nosotros queremos plantear esta acción que debe ser inmediata, porque los indicadores, tanto estadísticamente hablando que hace rato manejamos para señalar de que se necesita inversión, sí, se necesita inversión de manera global, donde hubo países o países desarrollados que tuvieron mayores oportunidades de hacer desarrollo industrial, no siempre está el daño ahí mismo, sino que el cambio climático puede acontecer en cualquier otro territorio del mundo. Y esto es lo que nos tiene que reflexionar. Señoras y señores, no hay fábrica de agua en el mundo, no hay fábrica de aire en el mundo, no hay remedios que se puedan superar a los desastres naturales. Por tanto, solamente la conducta de la humanidad es la que va a poder mejorar, y nosotros quisiéramos irnos de esta COP con una tarea que debe ser asumida permanentemente por los países en bien de la mejoría de lo que es la mejora del medio ambiente y la conservación del cambio climático. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Minister. May we now call on Excellencies from India, to be followed by Australia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I take the floor on behalf of the like-minded developing countries. The IPCC's sixth assessment report that clearly brings out the fact that Earth's climate is changing at a rapid pace, primarily due to the undisputed role of human influence. It brings out the fact that the developed countries have been major contributors to the carbon stock in the atmosphere, and which brings us to the underlying importance of the core principles of the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement: equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. As such, the provisions and principles of the Convention and its Paris Agreement should guide the discussions and outcomes of the new collective quantified goal to ensure an equitable result that enables climate action in developing countries. Nationally determined contributions are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and the achievements of its long-term goals. NDCs embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impact of climate change. Climate actions to meet the NDC targets require financial, technological, and capacity-building support from the developed countries. The ambitious goals set down by the developing countries requires substantive enhancement in climate finance from the floor of $100 billion per year. The mobilization of the resource needs to be led by the developed countries and should be long-term, concessional, climate-specific, and with equitable allocation between adaptation and mitigation projects. The commitment of US $100 billion made in 2009 by developed countries was not only minuscule, given the scale of the needs, but was also not achieved, and in fact has not yet been achieved yet. The Standing Committee on Finance, in its report, has estimated that the resources required are in the range of about US $6 trillion to about 11 trillion, depending upon the methodology that is used. And the methodology used includes the needs determination reports. Clearly, the need of climate finance is immense, and even when estimates don't always capture the identified needs, especially with respect to adaptation. We feel that the needs already determined through the reports can guide the mobilization and provisioning of resources by the developed countries. It is imperative that the technical expert dialogue concentrates on the quantum and quality of the resource mobilization. While the private sector may play a complementary role, the commitment is on the developed countries to lead the mobilization from various sources. The extent of public resources that the developed countries bring in will play a critical role in determining the climate flows. So it is disconcerting to see the focus that has been on private finance alone around the table today. While the previous TEDs on the new collective quantified goal under the ad hoc work program have presented an opportunity for exchange of ideas, we need a more structured and targeted approach so that there is a fulfillment of the mandate ahead of 2024. Discussions within the technical expert dialogue in 2023 should focus mainly on quantum, recognizing the urgency of such discussions for developing countries. That said, discussions on quality and other elements such as access and transparency are also incredibly important. A structure must be set in place moving forward to ensure decisions on all these elements are taken by 2024 as per the decision of 9/CMA3. Further, it is also important to highlight in this context that access to finance at market rate for climate action will lead to considerable stress on the finances of developing countries that the world cannot afford. Going ahead, if ambitious climate targets have to be achieved, these need to be backed by intentions reflected by ambition, appropriate and reasonable access to financial resources by developing countries. The NCQG needs to deliver on each of these grounds and thereby enable effective action by the developing countries. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. May we now call on Australia.
Thank you, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. Australia is really pleased to attend this first high-level ministerial dialogue on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. Australia recognises the critical role that climate finance plays to support developing countries in their climate action. We are focused on deploying high-quality climate finance to meet the needs of our developing country partners, including in the Pacific. A strong focus for us has always been on adaptation, and it will continue to be so, as this really reflects the needs of our region. We are on track to meet our doubled climate finance commitment made at COP26 of $2 billion over the period from 2020 to 2025. And as a quick update, in our most recent national budget on the 25th of October this year, the Australian Government committed to increasing Australia's official development assistance to the Indo-Pacific by more than $1.4 billion over 4 years, and this will include more support for climate action. On the new collective quantified goal, Australia really welcomed the COP26 decision to create a 3-year work program, and I'd like to thank Frederica and Kishan for chairing the process this year and for the comprehensive report on the 2022 ad hoc work program outcomes. We're really pleased to participate in all 4 technical expert dialogues, and we really welcome the progress made thus far. The new goal has the potential to play a key role not only in helping to address the needs and priorities of developing countries, but also to engage all finance actors towards shifting the trillions. I want to briefly highlight Australia's support for a number of outcomes in the report. Firstly, that a new goal should take a long-term perspective, which ensures available, accessible climate finance that is high quality, fit for purpose, and enables ambitious action. Secondly, the important role of the private sector and other non-state actor investment in mobilising the trillions of dollars needed to affect the scale of the global transition. Thirdly, that Article 2.1c is critical to accelerating private sector financial flows. And last but not least, that public finance and grant assistance will continue to play a fundamental role in supporting countries to mitigate emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change, particularly in SIDS and LDCs. As for the direction on the goal work program for 2023, on process, we would like to see increased structure around procedural elements, including submission timelines and topics, technical expert dialogue dates, locations and duration. On substance, we would like to see continued careful consideration of how public and private finance interact and deliver outcomes under the new goal. Public finance is essential for creating markets for new technologies, filling gaps where the private sector is unlikely to invest, and crowding in private capital through de-risking projects and technologies. And importantly, we need to ensure we're exploring all avenues of both finance and financiers. The new collective quantified goal needs to leave space for all high-income parties who can contribute and who want to contribute to do so. Australia is committed to working constructively with parties to ensure an ambitious and achievable outcome at COP29 in 2024. Thank you.